The alarm clock blared, its shrill tone cutting through the early morning silence. Ali groggily reached out to silence it, his hand brushing against the cold wooden nightstand. He blinked, trying to make sense of the numbers on the screen. 6:30 a.m. A sigh escaped his lips, the same time every day, yet the feeling of dread never seemed to fade. He sat up in bed, his body aching as if it had aged 10 years overnight. The room was dark, save for the soft glow of the city streetlights filtering through the half-open blinds. Outside, the sky was a dreary shade of gray. No sun, no warmth, just endless clouds. It was as if the entire world was caught in the same mood he was, heavy, lost, and tired. Ali swung his legs off the bed and stood up, his feet cold against the wooden floor. As he shuffled to the bathroom, his mind raced with thoughts that felt like they were getting louder with each passing day. Work, the endless piles of emails, deadlines that seemed impossible to meet, and meetings that stretched into oblivion. Relationships, the ones that had once felt full of warmth now felt distant, strained, like trying to hold on to sand that slipped through his fingers. And then, the big one, life's purpose. What was it all for? Was this what he had worked so hard for? Was this what he was meant to do? He had no answers, only questions, and the questions never seemed to end. He forced himself to get dressed, the same monotonous routine that had become all too familiar. A quick shower, a brush of his teeth, and a final glance in the mirror. His eyes were tired, dark circles under his eyes. A constant reminder of sleepless nights spent tossing and turning, thinking about everything and nothing at all. With a deep breath, Ali grabbed his keys from the counter and stepped out of the apartment. The cold air hit him as soon as he opened the door, and he pulled his jacket tighter around himself. It didn't help much. The world outside was just as gray as the sky above. The city was waking up slowly, like a giant stretching after a long, restless night. He climbed into his car and drove, his mind still clouded, his thoughts chasing each other in endless loops. The hum of the engine was the only sound as he navigated the empty streets. Ali's car came to a stop in front of his favorite coffee shop, a small, cozy place that always offered a temporary escape from the chaos of his life. He had been coming here for years, a regular among the faces that blurred in and out of his routine. The warm, comforting smell of freshly brewed coffee greeted him as soon as he stepped inside. For a moment, it almost felt like everything would be okay. Entering the coffee shop. The shop was warm and bustling with people, but despite the crowd, it felt oddly intimate. There was a sense of familiarity in the air, the chatter of people lost in their own worlds, the sound of espresso machines hissing and steaming, and the soft background music that played low enough to be comforting but not distracting. The barista behind the counter was smiling, a face he recognized but never really knew. The moment felt like it was suspended in time, as if this tiny corner of the world had paused just for him. Ali walked up to the counter and ordered his usual, a cappuccino with an extra shot of espresso. It was the one thing he could always count on to start his day, strong, rich, and warm. Nothing fancy, nothing extravagant, just something that made him feel like there was still a bit of control left in his life. He moved to the side, waiting for his drink, and for the first time that morning, he allowed himself to take a deep breath. The familiar atmosphere of the shop worked its magic, grounding him in a small sense of normalcy. He looked around at the other customers. Some were deep in conversation, others were focused on their laptops, typing away furiously. The world outside was still cold and indifferent, but inside this coffee shop, the warmth was almost palpable. Ali found an empty seat by the window and settled down, his mind still heavy with the thoughts that had followed him here. He stared out at the rain that was now falling in sheets, the droplets racing each other down the glass. It was a familiar sight, one he had seen countless times before, but today it felt different. Today it felt like the rain was washing away everything he was trying to avoid. His stress, his doubts, his fear. His cappuccino arrived, the rich aroma filling his nostrils, and he took a sip. The heat of the drink against his lips was soothing, but the momentary comfort it brought didn't last long. He set the cup down, his eyes drifting back to the rain. The same thoughts that had plagued him earlier returned. What was the point of it all? Was he meant to keep pushing through, surviving from one day to the next? Was there a grand plan, some higher purpose waiting to be discovered? Or was this all just a never-ending cycle of effort with no end in sight? Ali's fingers tapped nervously on the side of his cup, his thoughts a tangled mess of confusion. He was supposed to have it all figured out by now, wasn't he? People his age were out there building careers, getting married, having families. But he? He felt like he was stuck in a life that didn't feel like his own, trapped in a version of reality that didn't match the dreams he had once imagined for himself. The more he thought about it, the heavier it felt. He glanced at the clock on the wall. His break was almost over, and soon he would have to leave this small sanctuary and face the world again. For now, though, he allowed himself the luxury of staying still, of not having to make decisions, of not having to think about what came next. He pulled out his phone and mindlessly scrolled through social media, seeing posts of people living seemingly perfect lives. Pictures of vacations, engagements, children, milestones. It all felt so distant, as if those people were living a life he could never reach. Maybe he wasn't meant for any of that. Maybe this was just his fate. To live in a constant state of longing, surrounded by people but still feeling empty. The world outside was still a blur of gray, but for a moment, inside this coffee shop, it felt like everything was just as it should be. At least for now, he thought to himself. The door to the coffee shop creaked open, and the sound was enough to pull Ali's attention away from the rain outside. He turned just as a stranger stepped in, shaking the wetness from his coat. The man had a presence that immediately caught Ali's eye. He wasn't tall, but there was something about him, a calmness, a stillness that made him stand out in the busy, lively shop. The man wore a worn leather jacket, the edges frayed from years of use, but it only added to his mysterious aura. His hair was messy, but in a way that seemed deliberate, like someone who didn't care about appearances, but carried himself with quiet authority anyway. There was an almost magnetic quality to his presence, an energy that drew people in without him having to say a word. It was as if the air around him became charged with something unspoken, something profound. Ali, unsure of why he was so focused on this stranger, glanced away quickly, looking back at the rain as it blurred the outside world. He hadn't noticed how deeply lost he had been in his own thoughts until now, but there was something unsettling about the stranger. He felt as though the man's gaze had passed over him in some silent acknowledgement, but when he glanced up again, he saw the stranger was heading in his direction. The man approached his table with a calm, deliberate pace, and without hesitation, he stopped right in front of Ali. "Is this seat taken?" the stranger asked in a soft but confident tone. The words hit Ali like a wave. It wasn't the question that struck him. It was the tone. It felt almost as if the man already knew something about him, like he was aware of his isolation, of his confusion. Ali blinked, caught off guard by the directness. There was a strange, almost uncomfortable familiarity in the man's gaze. He felt like the stranger had somehow seen him, seen through him. And yet there was no judgment, only curiosity. "No, please." Ali gestured to the empty seat across from him, trying to shake the strange feeling in his chest. The man smiled faintly, as if this were exactly what he had expected. He sat down, the slight creak of the chair breaking the brief silence between them. Ali felt a small ripple of discomfort as the stranger settled in, as though this moment had been orchestrated. He couldn't explain it, but the air seemed to thicken with something intangible. The man wasn't just any passerby. There was something different about him. Something that made Ali feel like he wasn't supposed to be alone in this moment, even if he didn't know why. The first conversation. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ali, still unsettled, stared into his cappuccino, swirling it absent-mindedly. The stranger didn't move either. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table, as if he were waiting for something. Ali couldn't help but feel like the man was waiting for him to say something, to invite him into the conversation. And then, without warning, the stranger spoke. "What's bothering you today?" he asked, his voice low and calm, but there was a quiet intensity to it. Ali felt a jolt of surprise. He raised his eyes, meeting the stranger's gaze again. This wasn't a normal question. It was too direct, too personal. It was as if the stranger could see through the walls Ali had built around himself. Ali laughed nervously, unsure of how to respond. Was this some kind of joke? Who would ask a complete stranger such an intimate question? "What do you mean?" Ali asked, trying to play it off as a joke, his voice coming out more uncertain than he intended. The stranger's eyes never left him. There was no judgment in them, only calm understanding, as if he had already seen Ali's pain before. "I can see it, you know. The weight you carry." His words were matter-of-fact, but they weren't harsh. They were almost reassuring, like he wasn't afraid of what Ali was carrying. Whatever it was. Ali shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He felt a sharp tug in his chest, as if the stranger had just pulled at a thread he hadn't known was there. A small part of him wanted to ignore it, to pretend like he was fine. But the rest of him, the part that had been aching for an answer to all his questions, felt an undeniable pull to open up. The stranger didn't rush him. He simply watched patiently, his expression neutral, but somehow comforting. He didn't need to say more. The silence was enough. Finally, Ali spoke. His voice was quieter now, tinged with vulnerability. "I don't know. I feel lost." The words slipped out before he could stop them, and he immediately regretted it. But it was too late. The floodgate had opened. He wasn't sure why he was telling this man, someone he had never met before, something so personal. Maybe it was the way the stranger was looking at him, like he had all the time in the world to listen. "Lost in what?" the stranger asked softly. Ali took a deep breath, trying to hold back the swell of emotions that seemed to rush up from his chest. "In everything. I don't feel like I'm going anywhere. I don't know if I'm doing the right things with my life. I've been questioning everything. My job, my relationships, my purpose." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what's real anymore. I just feel like I'm drifting." The stranger nodded slowly, as if he had heard this many times before. "The problem with people is that they spend too much time looking for the answers." His voice was calm, but firm. "They forget to live the questions." Ali frowned, not fully understanding what the stranger meant. "Live the questions? What does that even mean?" The stranger smiled, but it wasn't an answer he could give in one sentence. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes focused on something beyond the window. "The answers will come on their own, in their own time. But right now you're asking the wrong questions. You're too focused on the destination. You're not living the moments in between, and that's where life happens, Ali. Right in the middle of everything you think you're supposed to have figured out." His tone was gentle, but carried the weight of someone who had lived a lifetime and seen these struggles before. Ali swallowed hard. The words were unsettling, but they also felt like something he had been waiting to hear without realizing it. His chest tightened as a feeling of deep longing crept up on him. He felt an urge, a strange, uncomfortable urge, to say more, to ask this man more, but he couldn't quite put it into words. The stranger's eyes softened, watching Ali closely. "You're not alone in this." Ali looked up, his heart pounding in his chest. For a brief moment, he could feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The silence that followed the stranger's words hung between them, a strange, heavy stillness. Ali wasn't sure what to say. There was a strange weight to the man's presence, a kind of calm that made it impossible for him to ignore the truth in his words, even if he didn't fully understand them. He took another sip of his cappuccino, its warmth doing little to soothe the swirling turmoil inside. The rain outside had intensified, now coming down in sheets, obscuring everything beyond the glass. It felt like the whole world was muted, except for the conversation they were having, which somehow felt more real than anything he had ever said aloud before. Ali finally let out a long breath, feeling the tension in his chest grow with each exhale. His hands were still trembling slightly as he set the cup down, staring at the dark liquid inside. "I don't know what's wrong with me," he said, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "I feel like I'm stuck, like I'm going through the motions of life, but none of it really means anything." The stranger didn't respond immediately, his eyes fixed on Ali, as if he was waiting for him to say more. The calmness in the man's demeanor was unsettling, but Ali felt an urge to open up, to speak more of the things that had been weighing on him for months. "I hate my job," Ali continued, his voice shaking slightly. "I feel like I'm just a cog in the machine, doing work that doesn't matter. Every day feels like the last, and every day feels like I'm just losing time." He paused, glancing down at his hands, which were now clenched in frustration. "And my relationships? They're falling apart too. I don't know why I can't connect with anyone anymore. I feel like I'm invisible, or like maybe I don't even know who I am anymore." The stranger sat in quiet observation, nodding occasionally, but never interrupting. His silence was comforting somehow, as though Ali's words had weight, like they mattered to someone. Ali didn't know why he was saying these things to a complete stranger, but it felt like the words had been waiting inside him for too long, begging for release. After a long pause, Ali let out a deep sigh, his voice filled with both frustration and exhaustion. "I'm just lost. I don't know where I'm going, and I don't even know if I want to keep going anymore." The stranger's gaze softened. There was a flicker of something unspoken in his eyes, a deep understanding that felt almost unsettling. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, he spoke in his calm, steady voice. "Do you know what's wrong with you?" Ali asked, his voice trembling as he looked at the stranger, desperately seeking an answer, an explanation, something that would help him understand why he felt so empty. The stranger paused for a moment, letting the question hang in the air. Then, with a soft, almost knowing smile, he replied, "Nothing." His words were simple but profound, and they hit Ali harder than any diagnosis ever could. "But you're asking the wrong questions." The stranger leaned forward slightly, as though sharing a secret. His voice was low but steady, carrying a weight that made Ali's chest tighten. "You're focused on the wrong things." Ali furrowed his brow, confused. "The wrong things? What do you mean?" The stranger's gaze didn't waver. "You're looking for answers, Ali. But the answers aren't the problem. The real issue is that you've forgotten how to ask the right questions." Ali's mind was reeling. What did that even mean? The confusion only deepened, but somehow the stranger's words resonated with him in a way that he couldn't explain. The stranger leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath, as though gathering his thoughts. Ali's mind was still buzzing with the strange feeling that this conversation was no ordinary encounter. There was a weight to the words being spoken, like they were more than just casual advice. This man, this stranger, was offering something deeper, something Ali couldn't fully grasp, but couldn't ignore either. "You see, Ali," the stranger began, his voice quieter now but still steady, "most people walk through life disconnected. They think the struggles they face, work, relationships, health, are isolated from the rest of the world. They forget that they are part of a bigger story. Ali's brow furrowed. What do you mean by bigger story? We are all connected, the stranger said, his tone softening with every word. Every one of us, every choice, every action, it all ripples out into the world, even if you can't see it. Ali felt a chill run down his spine, as though the stranger's words were peeling back layers of something he had buried deep inside. There was something profound in the simplicity of what the man was saying, but Ali still didn't fully understand. But Ali hesitated, unsure how to phrase the question. If we're all connected, why does it feel like I'm so alone? Why do I feel like nothing I do matters? The stranger didn't answer right away. He simply sat in silence for a moment, his gaze distant, as though he was looking beyond the walls of the coffee shop to some deeper truth. Finally, his eyes returned to Ali, and he spoke again, his voice heavy with wisdom. The problem isn't that you're alone, Ali. The stranger's eyes locked onto his. The problem is that you've forgotten how to see that you're part of something greater. You're so focused on finding the right answer, the perfect job, the perfect relationship, the perfect life, that you've lost sight of the bigger picture. Ali swallowed hard, the words hitting him like a punch to the gut. It felt almost like the stranger could see the very fabric of his soul, pulling apart the pieces he had carefully constructed over the years. Purpose, the stranger continued, isn't something you find, Ali. It's something you create. You create it by living, by moving forward, by trusting that you are part of something much bigger than yourself. Ali sat still, the weight of the words sinking in. But how do I create it? His voice was barely a whisper now. How do I find my purpose if I don't even know where to start? The stranger's eyes softened as he leaned forward slightly, his tone gentle but resolute. You start by letting go of the idea that you need to have it all figured out. You trust the journey, trust the moments. Purpose is a byproduct of living, of being present. It's not a destination, Ali. It's a way of being. Ali blinked, the realization starting to creep into his mind. It wasn't about the destination. There was no perfect life to reach. It was about living each moment fully, embracing the journey, and knowing that even when things felt uncertain, there was something bigger at play. The stranger's words left Ali with a deep sense of quiet, an unsettling yet comforting understanding that he was only just beginning to touch. For a long time, Ali had felt like he was carrying a burden, one that was too heavy to bear, one that he couldn't put down, no matter how hard he tried. It wasn't just his job or his relationships, but a deeper, more insidious weight. The sense that he wasn't living the way he should be, that he was always falling short, always one step behind in a race he didn't know how to win. But now, sitting in front of the stranger in this quiet coffee shop, something was beginning to shift. The words the man had spoken didn't just feel like advice. They felt like keys, unlocking doors that Ali had forgotten existed. Each sentence seemed to strip away layers of armor he had spent years building around himself. It was painful, but in a strange way it was also freeing. Ali could feel something stirring within him, something deep and unnameable. It was as if, for the first time in months, maybe years, he could breathe, like the walls he had surrounded himself with were finally starting to crumble. He didn't even realize how tightly he had been holding on to them until now. The stranger's voice broke through the whirlwind of thoughts in his mind. You've been so focused on controlling everything, Ali, on finding all the answers, but life isn't something you can control. Ali's chest tightened. The truth of it was undeniable. For so long he had lived in a constant state of searching for the next career move, the next step in a relationship, the next thing that would make him feel like he had life figured out. He had thought that if he just had the right answers, if he could just get things right, everything would fall into place. But now, as the stranger spoke, Ali realized how much he had been clinging to that illusion. Letting go doesn't mean giving up, the stranger continued, his voice calm but penetrating. It means releasing the need to have it all figured out, to live in the moments of uncertainty without fear. You've been chasing something that doesn't exist, the right answer, the perfect life. But that's what's been causing all your distress. Allie sat there, stunned. He had always thought that the answers were out there somewhere, just waiting for him to find them. He had chased them relentlessly, each answer seeming to promise relief, but never actually delivering it. Now he understood. He had been chasing a mirage. The real answer wasn't in finding the perfect life or the right job. The real answer was in the act of living itself. The journey is what matters, not the destination, the stranger said, his tone so gentle it felt like a mantra. You're so focused on the end, on where you think you need to be, that you forget to live the moments in between. The words hit Ali like a wave, washing over him. For the first time, he felt like someone understood the depth of his struggle. The years of striving, of trying to get everything right, all of it felt so exhausting now. And yet, there was a calm that was beginning to settle in, a quiet space where the need for constant striving was starting to fade. He took a deep breath, the weight of his inner chaos slowly lifting, like a fog lifting off a lake. It was strange, almost surreal, how light he felt all of a sudden, like he was shedding a skin he had worn for far too long. The anxiety, the fear, the sense that he was falling behind, it was still there, but it was becoming more manageable, less suffocating. For the first time in months, Ali didn't feel like he was alone. You are not alone in this, Ali, the stranger said, almost as if he were reading Ali's mind. You never have been. You just forgot how to see it. A wave of emotion surged through Ali, and his throat tightened. The tears that he had been holding back for so long now threatened to spill over. It wasn't just the sense of relief that was overwhelming him, but the realization that there was so much more to life than he had allowed himself to see. He was not alone, and he didn't have to have it all figured out. Ali swallowed, trying to steady his breath. For the first time, his mind felt quiet. The noise of his doubts and fears didn't seem as overwhelming as they had just a few moments ago. It was as though the stranger had given him permission to stop searching for all the answers and, instead, trust that he was already on the right path. The conversation slowed, as if the stranger was giving Ali time to absorb everything that had been said. There was a deep, almost peaceful energy in the air now. The coffee shop, with its bustling sounds and the steady rain outside, seemed to fade into the background. All that mattered in that moment was the quiet, the clarity, and the stillness that had begun to settle in Ali's heart. Ali leaned back in his chair, eyes closed for a moment, feeling the weight of everything, the struggle, the confusion, the frustration, begin to lift. He wasn't sure if he understood everything just yet, but he knew something had shifted inside of him. A part of him that had been lost for so long was beginning to find its way back. The stranger, too, sat in silence, a slight smile on his lips as though he knew exactly what Ali was feeling. There was no rush to the moment, no urgency. Ali realized that it was in this silence, this stillness, where the answers were coming, not in the words or the seeking. The realization felt almost like a release, that he didn't have to know everything. He didn't have to fix everything. He didn't have to be perfect. He simply had to live, and trust that life would unfold the way it was meant to. Ali opened his eyes and looked at the stranger, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He couldn't explain why, but this man, this stranger, had just given him the gift of peace. He had helped him see that life wasn't about finding the perfect answers, but about living through the questions, embracing the journey, and trusting that it all mattered, even when it felt uncertain. "Thank you," Ali said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. The stranger gave him a nod, as though he understood. There were no words left to say, only the shared understanding between them. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Ali felt a glimmer of hope. The world wasn't perfect, and neither was he. But he didn't need to be perfect anymore. He only needed to live. As the silence stretched on, and the coffee shop hummed with the background noises of quiet conversations and clinking cups, the stranger suddenly stood up, his movement smooth and purposeful. The shift in energy was immediate, like a door opening and closing in a space that had once felt still and peaceful. Ali looked up, surprised, as if waking from a dream. The stranger's words still echoed in his mind, their weight settling into his soul like a quiet promise. He had felt something shift inside of him, a kind of clarity he hadn't known was possible, but just as quickly as it had come, the moment was ending. The stranger was leaving. Ali opened his mouth to say something, but the words caught in his throat. He wanted to ask more, to thank the man, or perhaps to understand what had just happened. But before he could gather his thoughts, the stranger turned toward the door, his worn leather jacket moving with him in a fluid motion. "Wait!" Ali called out, standing up from his seat, his heart racing. He didn't want this to end. He didn't want the connection to vanish as quickly as it had appeared. The stranger paused at the door, turning to face him. His eyes were calm, unreadable, but there was a softness in his expression that made Ali feel like this moment was not as fleeting as it seemed. "Where are you going?" Ali asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and the unspoken need for closure. The stranger's smile was quiet and knowing, almost as if he had anticipated the question. He didn't answer right away, and for a moment it seemed like he was looking into Ali's eyes, seeing right through him. Then, with a calm, serene voice, he simply said, "You don't need to know." Ali's brow furrowed, confused, but somehow not bothered by the vagueness of the response. The stranger continued, his tone soft but heavy with meaning. "But remember what I said. Trust your journey." Ali felt a shiver run down his spine. The words felt like an echo in his mind, simple yet profound. The message wasn't just about what the stranger had said. It was about something deeper, something that connected Ali's present moment with something larger, something timeless. The stranger turned again, this time making his way toward the door. He walked out with a quiet grace, his figure slowly fading from view, as if the world around him had subtly shifted in his absence. Ali stood frozen for a moment, still processing the conversation. The weight of the stranger's words lingered in the air like a heavy mist. He wasn't sure if he should feel confused or at peace, but something told him that the journey, his journey, was just beginning. As the door clicked shut behind the stranger, Ali slowly sank back into his chair, still staring at the spot where the man had been. A strange sensation crept over him, a sense of both loss and gratitude. It was like a dream that was vivid while it lasted, and yet, as it ended, he wasn't sure if it had been real. Then, a strange thought flickered into his mind, and he turned back to look at the counter. He had been so absorbed in their conversation that he hadn't paid attention to the small details. His eyes scanned the area where the stranger had sat. He hadn't seen him pay for his coffee. In fact, Ali couldn't even remember him ordering anything at all. Ali blinked, then looked around the shop, wondering if anyone else had noticed. But the barista was busy with another customer, and the rest of the patrons seemed oblivious to the strange encounter that had just unfolded. He thought about it for a moment. Had the stranger even really been there? The thought was fleeting, and for some reason, Ali didn't feel the need to probe further. It didn't matter. It didn't matter that the stranger hadn't paid for his drink or even ordered one. The conversation, the clarity, the moment, that was all that mattered. Everything else seemed irrelevant. Ali smiled to himself, shaking his head slightly. "It's just one of those things, I guess," he muttered under his breath. He finished his cappuccino, now lukewarm, but still comforting. The weight in his chest had lightened, The uncertainty about his life no longer felt as suffocating. It wasn't gone, but it was manageable now. There was no rush to fix everything. The journey was enough. Ali looked out the window again, the rain having slowed to a gentle drizzle. The world outside seemed to be moving in its own way, unfolding moment by moment. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could move with it. Trust his journey. He didn't need to know where it would take him. He didn't need to know what would happen next. He only needed to live. And with that realization, Ali stood up, the weight on his shoulders no longer so heavy. He walked to the door, feeling a sense of calm that had been missing from his life for far too long. As he stepped out into the drizzle, he took a deep breath and smiled to himself, ready to face whatever came next. Ali sat back in his chair, still reeling from the conversation, feeling a strange mix of peace and disbelief. He wasn't sure what had just happened or if it had all been real. The world outside had resumed its usual pace, the rain pattering softly against the window, and the hum of quiet conversations filled the room. Yet everything had changed for him. He had no idea how long he had been sitting there, lost in thought, when the barista approached his table with a puzzled expression on his face. The young man looked around the coffee shop before focusing his gaze on Ali. "Did you see the guy who was sitting with you?" the barista asked, his voice tinged with confusion. "The one with the jacket?" Ali blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the question. He glanced around, his mind trying to process what the barista was asking. The stranger had been there, right? He remembered the soft, knowing voice, the quiet wisdom that had resonated so deeply with him. But now, as he looked around the shop, there was no sign of the man, no trace. "No, I didn't see anyone," Ali replied, his voice uncertain, though a strange unease was beginning to stir inside him. The barista frowned slightly, as if trying to reconcile what he had seen with what he was hearing. His eyes flickered toward the door, and then back to Ali. "Well, he came in, ordered nothing, and just sat here for hours. I thought he might have been waiting for someone, but, well, he just left without a word. It was strange." Ali felt a chill run through him. Was it possible he had imagined the whole thing? The conversation had felt so real, so vivid. But now, as he tried to recall the exact details, something felt off. Had he hallucinated it? Was he just in such a fragile state that his mind had conjured the stranger as a form of comfort? The barista shrugged, the confusion still clear in his eyes. "I don't know." Weird, right? Ali didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded, offering a faint smile, his thoughts swirling. The more he thought about it, the stranger's words, "Trust your journey," seemed to hold more weight than ever. It didn't matter whether the man was real or not. What mattered was that the encounter had changed him, in a way that went beyond physical presence. Maybe the stranger had been real, or maybe he hadn't been. But in that moment, Ali understood. It wasn't the details that mattered. It was the message. Ali's gaze shifted to the table where something small and white had caught his eye. It was a scrap of paper, nearly invisible against the dark wood. He picked it up, his fingers trembling slightly. As he unfolded it, the words on the paper were simple, but they felt like a lifeline. "You are not alone. Keep going." The words were short and to the point, but they resonated deep within him, as though the universe had sent this small note to confirm the transformation taking place in his heart. It was exactly what he needed to hear, exactly what he had been searching for. In a world where so many things felt out of his control, this note reminded him that he was connected to something larger. It didn't matter what had happened with the stranger. It didn't even matter if the encounter had been real. The note was real. The change was real. A soft smile spread across Ali's face as he folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket. He felt lighter somehow, as if a burden had been lifted without him even realizing it. The weight in his chest had dissipated, and for the first time in ages, Ali felt a quiet sense of peace. He stood up from the table, leaving a tip for the barista who seemed lost in thought, still scanning the room for the elusive man in the jacket. Ali made his way to the counter, paid for his coffee, and stepped outside into the damp, cool air. As Ali walked down the street, the noise of the city seemed to fade into the background. The clamor of honking horns, the chatter of pedestrians, the rush of bicycles, they all blurred into a soft hum, as if the world itself had quieted in reverence to his thoughts. The rain had slowed to a soft drizzle, the kind that painted everything with a quiet glow. It felt like the beginning of something new. The uncertainty of life, which had once been so overwhelming, no longer seemed as terrifying. The world didn't have to be perfect. He didn't have to have all the answers. Ali's steps were lighter now, each one feeling more grounded, more connected to the present moment. He wasn't afraid of the unknown anymore. He didn't need to rush forward, trying to fix everything. He knew now that life was not about the destination. It was about how he walked the path, how he trusted the journey. You are not alone. Keep going. The words from the note echoed softly in his mind, and for the first time in a long time, Ali felt truly seen. Not by the stranger, not by anyone else, but by himself. He was not alone in his struggles. He was part of something much larger, a thread in the tapestry of the universe, connected to everyone and everything. Ali smiled as he walked, the rain falling gently around him. He wasn't sure where the road would take him, but he knew that with each step, he was moving toward something better, toward a life that wasn't about perfection, but about living fully in the moments between. And that, he realized, was enough.